Schools are supposed to create knowledge, discipline, and maybe one or two functioning adults. History somehow turned them into chaos factories. In this video, we are going through the dumbest, weirdest, most spectacularly unhinged school and university facts ever recorded, from armed students and academic riots to prison cells, prank warfare, and decisions so bad they deserve their own diploma. 1. Thomas Jefferson built the University of Virginia to be a shining temple of reason, learning, and enlightened debate. Lovely idea. The actual campus in its early years felt more like a saloon, where everyone had read a little philosophy and also happened to be armed. In the 1820s and 1830s, students routinely carried pistols to class, and campus arguments had an alarming habit of turning into gunfire. Some students shot at professors they disliked. Others shot at fellow students over insults, grudges, or wounded pride, which is a spectacularly stupid way to handle academic disagreement. In 1840, one professor was killed by a student. Things got so ugly that faculty talked about resigning together. Jefferson, near the end of his life, had to step in personally to calm the place down. Imagine paying tuition just to risk getting shot over a lecture. 2. Medieval Ireland trained poets in a way that sounds less like education and more like a very stylish hostage situation. At bardic schools, students were sometimes sent into total darkness with a theme or poetic challenge and told to compose entirely in their heads. No bright classroom, no notes, no kindly teacher asking for participation. Just darkness, silence, and in some cases a heavy stone placed on the chest to help them concentrate and make sure they did not drift off to sleep. Because apparently discomfort was considered an academic resource. They could stay there for hours, sometimes nearly a full day, building verses in the dark before emerging to recite what they had created. The theory was that removing all distractions sharpened the mind. It sounds deeply miserable, but it produced some of Ireland's most respected poets. So yes, apparently great art sometimes begins with being mildly buried alive. 3. In 1355, two Oxford students walked into the Swindlestock Tavern, ordered wine, took one sip, and decided it tasted like regret in liquid form. They complained. The tavern keeper insulted them back. Naturally, instead of everyone acting like adults for even 10 seconds, the students threw the wine in his face. And from that tiny little argument about a bad drink, the entire city managed to launch one of the deadliest town and gown riots in English history. The St. Scholastica Day riot dragged on for 3 days. Townspeople came armed with bows and axes. Students fought back with swords and whatever else they could grab. More than 60 people died. Over terrible wine. Afterward, the town of Oxford had to make a yearly apology to the university and pay a fine for centuries. That is an all-time overreaction to poor customer service. 4. In many American colleges during the 19th and early 20th centuries, students celebrated the end of the school year with a wonderfully dramatic custom known as the textbook funeral. Once exams were over and summer freedom was in sight, they gathered their most hated books, especially the ones responsible for maximum suffering like mathematics and Latin, and staged full funeral processions for them. They dressed in black, carried the doomed volumes in tiny coffins, marched solemnly across campus, and delivered mock eulogies as if these books had lived awful but meaningful lives. Then came the burial or burning, sometimes complete with fake grave markers and students pretending to cry over the loss. It was ridiculous, theatrical, and honestly pretty relatable. Some universities even preserved photographs of these ceremonies. The tradition mostly vanished, but the emotional need to publicly mourn a horrible textbook absolutely did not. 5. Pythagoras is remembered as the triangle guy, which is already a pretty strange form of immortality, but his school had rules that were even stranger than the theorem. The big one was simple and insane at the same time: no beans. His followers were forbidden from eating them, especially fava beans, and the reason depends on which ancient explanation you believe. Some said Pythagoras thought beans contained the souls of the dead, so eating them was basically ghost cannibalism. Others claimed beans resembled human embryos, which is not a sentence anyone wanted from a philosophy teacher. Another theory said their hollow stems created pathways for souls moving between the living world and the underworld. There is even a story that he was caught by enemies and refused to escape through a bean field, choosing death over bean contact. Whether that final bit is true or not, the bean ban itself was real, and his students obeyed it with frightening seriousness. 6. For a huge stretch of history, being left-handed was treated like a character flaw, a bad habit, or in some places practically a spiritual defect. The Latin word for left gave us the word sinister, which tells you a lot about how kindly society handled this. Schools turned that prejudice into policy. Children who naturally wrote with their left hand were forced to switch, often through humiliating and painful methods. Teachers tied left arms behind backs, strapped hands to chairs, smacked fingers with rulers, or used devices made specifically to keep the left hand out of action. If a child resisted, the response was punishment, not curiosity. This lasted far longer than people like to admit, continuing deep into the 20th century. Only in the 1960s and 1970s did education systems start admitting that forcing hand dominance caused stress and harm while solving absolutely nothing. Imagine turning basic biology into a disciplinary problem. 7. Rutgers and Princeton have spent more than a century proving that higher education does not automatically produce mature behavior. Their rivalry famously centered on one glorious object of obsession: a cannon. In 1875, Rutgers students sneaked onto Princeton's campus and stole a Revolutionary War cannon that Princeton displayed with great pride. Princeton got it back. Rutgers stole it again. Princeton retaliated, and on it went year after year because apparently nobody involved had a more productive hobby. Eventually, Princeton got so tired of the thefts that it buried the cannon in concrete with only the barrel exposed, which sounds like something you do after accepting that diplomacy is dead. Rutgers students still tried to dig it out. Rutgers later protected its own cannon the same way. So now both schools have cannons permanently trapped in stone, like archaeological evidence of a rivalry so petty it had to be cemented into the ground. 8. In medieval and early modern Europe, earning a diploma did not just get you academic recognition, it also got you a luxury object expensive enough to show off. These diplomas were often written on vellum, a carefully prepared animal skin usually made from sheep or calves, and producing it was a slow, costly process. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, dried, and finished before anyone even started writing. Good vellum was not cheap. A single diploma could represent the value of weeks of labor, which meant the document itself was part credential, part wealth display. Rich families proudly exhibited them because they proved more than scholarship, they proved money. When paper diplomas became more common, many people first saw them as inferior substitutes, the budget version of academic glory. So yes, the original graduation flex was not the degree itself. It was the fact that your success had been written on expensive animal skin. 9. Medieval universities had initiation rituals that make modern campus hazing look almost polite. New students were treated as if they had arrived not as people but as wild animals who needed to be turned into civilized scholars by force and embarrassment. In ceremonies called things like beaning or deposition, freshmen were mocked as creatures with horns, claws, rough fur, and beaks. Older students would symbolically file down these imaginary animal features, sometimes pressing actual tools against heads and hands, just to make the point extra unpleasant. Water or wine might be dumped over them to wash away their beastly ignorance. Ears were pulled, heads were roughly shaved, and public humiliation was basically the whole curriculum for the day. The amazing part is that university authorities often approve this nonsense as a proper educational ritual. Apparently, in medieval higher education, the path to wisdom began with being publicly treated like livestock. 10. Cambridge once had a tradition that managed to be cruel, funny, and weirdly honorable all at once. The student who scraped through the mathematical tripos with the lowest passing score received the wooden spoon. And no, this was not a polite metaphor. It was a gigantic actual spoon, sometimes over 5 feet long, dramatically presented to the unlucky survivor of the exam. The ceremony became its own little campus spectacle. Students decorated the spoon with ribbons, inscriptions, and mockery, then paraded the recipient around as the hero of academic mediocrity. Over time, the spoons became bigger and more absurd, because obviously the only sensible response to a ridiculous tradition is escalation. Strangely, the award gained a kind of prestige. At least you passed and got a story instead of disappearing into the gray fog of average results. The tradition finally ended in 1909 when exam reporting changed and the lowest passer could no longer be identified. Some mathematicians probably celebrated in private. 11. From 1712 to 1914, Heidelberg University had its own student prison, the Studentenkarzer, which sounds terrifying until you learn it was basically detention with branding opportunities. Students who got in trouble for drinking, dueling, causing disorder, or generally acting like overconfident academics were sent there instead of facing normal legal consequences. But the place was not exactly a pit of despair. Prisoners could still attend classes, receive visitors, and even arrange for food and beer from outside, because apparently German discipline had room for hospitality. The real treasure was the walls. For generations, students covered every inch with graffiti, poems, drawings, names, and self-portraits, turning punishment into a collaborative art project. Getting locked up became a badge of honor, the sort of thing you wanted on your personal legend. Some students supposedly misbehaved on purpose just to spend time there. Today, it is a museum, which is fitting, because student rebellion rarely gets preserved this beautifully. 12. In March 1939, a Harvard freshman named Lothrop Withington Jr. swallowed a live goldfish to win a $10 bet. That should have remained one stupid decision by one bored teenager. Instead, America looked at it and said, yes, let us make this a trend. Within weeks, universities across the country were full of students trying to swallow more goldfish than the last fool. The numbers climbed fast, from a handful to dozens, until people were claiming absurd totals like 89 fish in one sitting. Pet stores were cleaned out. Animal welfare groups protested. Doctors warned students about parasites and disease. The Massachusetts legislature even discussed legal protection for goldfish because apparently lawmakers had to step in when college culture went fully off the rails. And what ended the craze? Not wisdom, not compassion. World War II happened, and suddenly the nation had larger concerns than treating aquarium pets like competitive snacks. 13. The Spartan is often praised as the machine that turned boys into legendary warriors, but a lot of its methods were basically child abuse with patriotic branding. Boys entered the system around age 7, were taken from their families, and raised under harsh military discipline. One deliberate part of the training was hunger. They were given too little food on purpose so they would learn to steal, because Spartan society admired cunning almost as much as toughness. The truly insane twist was that stealing itself was not the problem. Getting caught was. If a boy was punished, it was not for taking food, but for being incompetent enough to fail at it. A famous story tells of a boy who hid a stolen fox under his cloak and let it tear into his body rather than reveal what he had done. Whether that tale is exact history or not, it reflects the Spartan mindset perfectly. Survive, endure, and never admit weakness, even when the lesson is clearly deranged. 14. Medieval students at places like Oxford and Cambridge enjoyed a legal advantage so outrageous it is amazing townspeople did not riot more often. Because students were often classed as members of the clergy, they could claim what was known as benefit of clergy and avoid regular secular courts. So, if an ordinary townsman committed a serious crime, the consequences could be brutal. If a student did something similar, the case might end up in an ecclesiastical court run by the church, where punishments were often soft, slow, or laughably gentle. Assault, violent disorder, sometimes even homicide could lead to penance, fines, or comfortable confinement instead of real justice. You can see why local residents were furious. They had to watch young scholars swagger through the streets, cause chaos, hurt people, and still receive treatment that felt more like a stern spiritual reminder than a sentence. For centuries, this double standard poured fuel on the constant hostility between universities and the communities forced to live beside them. 15. All Souls College at Oxford has one of the most gloriously unnecessary traditions in academic history, the Mallard Hunt. According to college legend, when the foundations were being dug in 1438, a giant mallard flew out of the ground, which already sounds like the sort of story invented after too much wine and zero skepticism. Naturally, the college decided this absolutely demanded a ceremony. Not every year, not every decade, but once every 100 years, because nonsense somehow becomes more majestic when scheduled rarely. During the ritual, fellows parade through the college at night with torches and sticks, singing the Mallard song while pretending to search for the legendary duck. Someone is carried around in a chair as the Lord Mallard, because if you are going to commit to absurdity, commit properly. They inspect rooms, rooftops, and corners as if the bird might genuinely be hiding. They never find it, which is shocking only if you believe in magical foundation ducks. 16. In 1766, Harvard students finally reached the end of their patience over one truly disgusting subject: the butter in the dining hall. This was not a case of spoiled rich kids complaining that brunch lacked elegance. By multiple accounts, the butter was rancid, foul, and barely fit for human consumption. Students complained through normal channels and got nowhere, so campus life moved naturally into revolt mode. Meals were disrupted, tempers rose, and the dining hall became the center of open resistance. One student, Asa Dunbar, later famous as the grandfather of Henry David Thoreau, delivered a fiery speech denouncing the butter as unacceptable. The protest spread. Windows were broken, property was damaged, and students openly challenged the administration. Harvard responded in the classic institutional style of the era, not by fixing the problem first, but by expelling Dunbar and other leaders for daring to complain in public. Thus, the Butter Rebellion entered American history, proving student protest can begin with ideology or with dairy that smells like death. 17. China's imperial examination system offered one of history's harshest bargains. Pass, and you could rise into government service, wealth, and family honor. Fail, and you returned home with nothing but exhaustion and disappointment. No pressure at all. Candidates in the Keiju system were locked into tiny individual cells for days at a time, often for as long as 3 days, with just enough space to sit, write, eat, and suffer. They had to bring their own food, water, bedding, and chamber pot while producing essays, poetry, and elegant interpretations of classical texts under unbelievable pressure. The stress broke people. Some candidates had mental collapses during the exam. Some died in the cells from illness or exhaustion. When that happened, officials reportedly removed the body and kept the examinations going. Imagine trying to write polished philosophy while a corpse is being carried away nearby, and everyone around you pretends this is just part of the procedure. Bureaucratic ambition has rarely looked so grim. 18. In some medieval monasteries and religious schools, silence was not a study aid. It was basically a way of life enforced with the seriousness of military law. Students and monks were forbidden to speak except at tightly controlled moments, such as prayer, formal responses, or direct academic necessity. Since humans stubbornly continue needing things even when speech is banned, these institutions developed elaborate sign systems to cover daily life. There were gestures for bread, water, books, tools, chores, and plenty more, turning routine communication into a kind of holy mime performance. Break the silence and punishment could follow, ranging from fasting to extra labor or physical discipline. The logic behind all this was that speech encouraged gossip, distraction, pride, and sin, while silence brought the soul closer to God. Which sounds noble until you imagine spending years in school where casual conversation is treated like moral collapse. It is hard to build social skills when asking for lunch already feels like a covert operation. 19. Yale introduced a tradition called bladder ball in the 1950s, and the concept was almost insultingly simple. Release a giant inflatable ball into a mass of students and let teams push it toward opposite goals. No refined strategy, no sensible structure. Just hundreds of people shoving one oversized ball through campus like civilization had briefly collapsed. Predictably, the event turned into chaos almost every single time it was played. Students crashed into each other, windows got smashed, cars were damaged, and the ball barreled through streets while traffic and good judgment disappeared together. By 1982, Yale officials had finally seen enough and banned it. That should have been the end of the story, but students kept trying to revive it because university traditions die only when absolutely stabbed. In 2009, a replacement ball appeared and disorder erupted again within minutes. Authorities destroyed it. Yale had discovered the tragic truth that some traditions are too stupid to survive and too entertaining to stay dead. 20. In 19th century and early 20th century Germany, student fencing was not mainly about sport, self-defense, or even winning. It was about earning a dramatic facial scar and wearing it like a diploma in pain tolerance. Members of fencing fraternities fought formal duels with sharp blades under strict rules. They wore protection for the eyes and neck, but cheeks and foreheads were left exposed on purpose. The goal was not to dodge beautifully or outplay an opponent. In fact, flinching too much could make you look weak. What many participants wanted was a deep, visible cut, called a schmiss, because that scar advertised courage, toughness, and social status. Some students even encouraged ugly healing by irritating the wound, so the mark would stand out more. Neat medical stitching was not always appreciated. A clean result defeated the whole point. Imagine paying for higher education and leaving with the academic equivalent of saying, "Yes, I did let a man slice my face for prestige." 21. When tuberculosis terrified the world in the early 1900s, fresh air was treated by many doctors like a miracle cure. Schools responded with one of the strangest educational ideas ever attempted: the open-air classroom. In Germany, Britain, the United States, and elsewhere, children were taught outdoors even in bitter winter weather because adults had decided that freezing slightly was better than breathing indoor air. Students sat wrapped in heavy coats, blankets, and special sleeping bag-style coverings while trying to read and write with numb fingers. Teachers arrived to find ink frozen solid. Children wore fingerless gloves so they could hold pens, which is useful until your hands stop cooperating entirely. Snow sometimes drifted onto desks while lessons continued because science at the time was doing its very best with incomplete information. Whether the system truly helped with tuberculosis remains debated. What it definitely accomplished was creating schools where education felt less like learning and more like surviving a very polite outdoor punishment. 22. In the early 1800s, Trinity College at Cambridge had a clear rule against students keeping dogs. Most people would read that, sigh, and move on. Lord Byron looked at the same rule and saw an opening for chaos. Since the statutes banned dogs, but said nothing about bears, he acquired a tame bear and kept it while living at the university. This was classic Byron behavior: theatrical, stubborn, and just self-aware enough to know exactly how annoying he was being. He reportedly walked the animal on a leash and defended himself by pointing out that the college had indeed listed several forbidden creatures, yet somehow forgotten to include bears, which, to be fair, would not usually seem like a dangerous administrative oversight. The authorities were left in the awkward position of realizing that their regulations had been defeated by technical accuracy and poet-level mischief. Legend even claims Byron joked that the bear deserved a fellowship. Honestly, after exposing that loophole, the bear had earned consideration. 23. British boarding schools like Eton and Harrow long maintained a system called fagging, which sounds harmless until you learn it was basically a school-approved servant arrangement for younger boys. Junior students were assigned to older ones and expected to perform chores, errands, and personal service as if feudalism had simply transferred into education and changed into a uniform. These boys polished shoes, delivered messages, made food, fetched items at ridiculous hours, and handled whatever petty demands their seniors produced. One especially humiliating task reportedly involved warming toilet seats on cold mornings by sitting on them first, because heaven forbid an older student encounter a chilly inconvenience. The shocking part is not that this happened. It is that schools openly defended it as character building. Supposedly, it taught discipline and responsibility. What it more likely taught was obedience, resentment, and a very clear understanding of who got to be comfortable at someone else's expense. Elite education really had a talent for dressing exploitation in respectable language. 24. Before Napoleon became the man who redrew Europe and terrified half the continent, he was just an awkward Corsican schoolboy at the military academy in Brienne, trying not to fit in with richer French classmates who already looked down on him. He was not especially polished, his accent marked him as an outsider, and socially he was not exactly the star of the room. But when it came to strategy, the boy was already alarming. During one winter, the school organized a snowball fight, which for most children meant chaos, screaming, and bad throwing. Napoleon treated it like a military campaign. He organized his side into units, directed the building of snow forts and defensive positions, arranged attacks with actual coordination, and turned a playground fight into a demonstration of tactical thinking. His team crushed the opposition. It became one of those school stories people remembered because the weird kid everyone underestimated had just transformed snow into battlefield science. 25. Medical schools in the 18th and 19th centuries faced a deeply awkward problem. Anatomy required bodies, but legal access to corpses was extremely limited. Officially, only executed criminals could usually be used, and there were not enough of them to satisfy the exploding demand for medical training. So the gap was filled by one of the darkest side hustles in education. Medical students and their associates often turned to grave robbing, digging up the newly buried and selling or delivering the bodies to anatomy professors. In some cases, this work helped students pay for training. Families noticed, understandably panicked, and began guarding cemeteries or installing iron cages called mort safes over graves to keep the dead from being stolen. Entire networks of resurrection men emerged to supply schools. The image is hard to beat. Future doctors training to preserve life, sneaking through graveyards at night with shovels, not because they were villains in a Gothic novel, but because the medical system had built itself on a terrifying shortage. 26. In February 1854, Yale students started what looked like an innocent winter pastime, a snowball fight. That lasted about 5 minutes before it evolved into civic disorder with a ridiculous amount of enthusiasm. More students joined, the crowd swelled, and soft snow turned into packed ice missiles because apparently nobody on campus believed in moderation. Windows shattered. Townspeople got pulled into the chaos and fought back. The fire department was called, which sounds sensible until the students started pelting firefighters too. Firefighters responded by turning hoses on the crowd, which naturally made everything worse. Police were summoned. The mess spilled into city streets. Eventually, the mayor arrived and literally read the riot act, formally ordering the crowd to disperse or face arrest. Think about how absurd that is. A recreational snowball fight escalated so badly that the chief civic response became legal proclamation, arrests, and property damage reports. Yale then banned large snowball fights for years, which feels less like an overreaction and more like survival. 27. The dunce cap has one of history's most unfair glowdowns. It traces back to John Duns Scotus, a major medieval philosopher whose followers, known as dunsmen, were associated with serious intellectual prestige. Their pointed caps were not signs of stupidity at all. Quite the opposite. Some believe the shape helped channel wisdom from above into the wearer's mind, basically turning the hat into a theological knowledge funnel. For a while, that pointy headwear signaled education and high learning. Then the Renaissance arrived, and new thinkers started mocking the old scholastic tradition as dusty, backward, and embarrassingly outdated. The insults stuck. Duncemen became dunces. The hat that once hinted at cleverness became the universal costume for a fool. By the 16th century, the whole thing had flipped completely. Imagine being so thoroughly defeated by changing intellectual fashion that your school's signature look ends up as a permanent symbol of idiocy in classrooms and cartoons. 28. Students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have a long tradition of massive pranks they politely call hacks. But the 1994 police car stunt sits in a category of its own. One morning, people looked up at the Great Dome and saw what appeared to be a full campus police car parked on top of it. The car had flashing lights, a dummy police officer inside, and even a box of donuts for extra disrespect. There was also a parking ticket on the windshield, which really completed the whole masterpiece. The obvious question was how anyone managed to get a car onto the roof. The answer made the prank even better. Students did not hoist it up whole. They took the vehicle apart, carried the pieces to the top, and reassembled everything overnight with engineering precision that was honestly impressive on a technical level. MIT officials were not exactly delighted, but many were also visibly amused. It was criminally nerdy and somehow beautiful. 29. Georgetown University's Healy Hall has a clock tower, and generations of students looked at its clock hands and apparently thought, yes, these belong to us now. The theft happened again and again over the years. The university replaced the hands, students stole them, and the cycle repeated like some very specific academic curse. But Georgetown, being a Catholic Jesuit school, added a truly bizarre twist. Students sometimes mailed the stolen clock hands to the Pope in Vatican City, because if you are going to commit a campus prank, why not involve the head of the Catholic Church, for no practical reason whatsoever? The Vatican reportedly sent the clock hands back more than once, which means someone there had to process international deliveries of stolen American clock parts and decide this was worth returning. Eventually, Georgetown solved the problem the old-fashioned way, not with sermons or moral reflection, but with better engineering. Divine authority failed. Anti-theft design finally got the job done. 30. Many Victorian-era schools in Britain, especially those serving working-class children, looked less like places for intellectual growth and more like training grounds for obedience. Students spent hours marching, drilling, lining up, and responding instantly to whistle commands with military-style precision. Order mattered more than curiosity. Discipline mattered more than imagination. The academic side was usually narrow and practical. Basic reading, basic writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction, enough to make children useful and manageable but not necessarily independent thinkers. Officials were often quite open about the purpose. Schools were meant to produce disciplined workers and compliant citizens for the empire, people who would staff factories, serve in the military, and follow instructions without developing inconvenient ideas of their own. Creativity in lower-class children was often treated less as a gift and more as a possible threat. So yes, for many students, the hidden curriculum of school was simple: stand straight, stay quiet, and become useful to somebody more powerful. 31. Eton's wall game may be the most gloriously unproductive sport ever preserved by human tradition. It has been played since at least 1766, and from the outside it looks like a group of privileged young men have collectively agreed to spend their time shoving each other beside a brick wall for almost no reward. Two teams of 10 push, wrestle, and inch a ball along a narrow strip of ground with rules so complicated they seem designed to discourage outside understanding. Scoring is not merely difficult, it is practically mythical. A shy, one of the game's scoring moments, already requires a bizarre sequence of positioning and timing. A full goal is even harder and has not happened since 1909. That means more than a century of annual effort with no proper scoring success. Yet they keep playing, covered in mud and tradition, because apparently the true point of the sport is not winning. It is proving that elite institutions can maintain absolutely anything if they call it heritage. 32. One of the great 19th century school and university pranks involved getting a cow onto a roof, which sounds impossible until you remember that students with enough free time are nature's least responsible engineers. The trick actually worked because cows can be coaxed upstairs or ramps if guided carefully enough, especially when the humans involved are determined and the cow has not been informed of the plan. The real problem came later. Cows can usually manage going up because their bodies lean forward naturally. Coming down is the nightmare. Descending stairs requires a backward balance and posture that many cows simply do not handle well, so they panic, freeze, and refuse to move. Which means the prank instantly transforms from funny to catastrophically logistical. Suddenly, you need pulleys, cranes, complex rigging, or some truly grim alternatives to get the animal down. All because somebody discovered a biological limitation and decided that the correct response was to turn it into a campus event. Now settle this properly in the comments. Which fact in this video was the absolute champion of academic stupidity? And what school or university story did we miss that would have embarrassed everything here? I want the most outrageous one. If this video was your kind of historical chaos, hit like, subscribe, and stick around because history gets even dumber from here.